This is a poem called Dog Stars. Like you, I have a hard time with constellations, not just the frustrating connect the dot nonsense of imagined shapes, but the assumption that certain stories will help make sense of the infinite. Why those stories and not some others? Why not our stories, is my thought. Not Leo up there, but Henry, my old black lab, ears cocked forward, puzzling his way through a command. Dead now, 14 years. That's Henry up there for sure. I'm staking a claim. And why let the Pleiades keep rolling around unchallenged when there's my grandfather with his 4 fingers, one of them lost to a cane grinder when he was a child? Instead of Ursus Minor and Major, why not that mule deer buck I killed in 1982 with its perfect star-shaped antlers? This is not, as the Chinese would tell you, the year of the rat, the cat, or the dragon. Rather, it's the year of mortgage payments and construction paper, crayons and glue sticks. It's the year of Costco mums on the porch and COVID masks, maybe a new tennis racket. Arguments on Facebook, friends won and lost. It's the year of standing in the backyard waiting for the dog to pee, staring up at the emerging stars and thinking helplessly again and again, they go on forever. They just go on forever.
All right. Welcome to another episode of Poets in Montana. And today the guest with us is Alan Morris Jones, and his new book of poems, Mumblecusser and other poems, just out from Drumlummon Institute. And thank you for joining me today, Alan.
Thank you, Mark. This is a gas. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was kind of involved in this book, and that you asked me to do a blurb for it, so I
You
feel
bet.
proud to be on the back cover with Michael Earl Craig, and this is a beautiful cover. This is Dale Livesey
You bet.
paint. Yeah.
Yeah, man. It takes a village to publish any sort of book. Very grateful to you and Earl for the blurbs, and very grateful to Dale for the beautiful painting. It all came together. So thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean it is. I've thought that myself in the past. I've been felt so lucky and humbled that people have donated or allowed me to use stuff for covers of books of poetry, because unfortunately, as we know, right, books of poetry, you can't afford to pay them what it's worth, right? I mean, a beautiful work of art on a $15 to $20 collection of poems. Yeah, it's always cool to have that. I mean, what a great way to invite people inside when you see that cover.
It makes all the difference in the world, man. It really does.
Totally. So anyway, I guess just briefly, we should sort of introduce you to people who don't know much about you. And you came to poetry. Well, I mean, in terms of publishing poetry, you've come to that later than you've been writing for quite some time. You've been
Yeah,
written.
I've been in the business, if you will, since for the last 30 years. Basically, I started out in the mid '90s as editor of the magazine Big Sky Journal. Went from there to published my first novel, Last Year's River, in 2000. So stepped away from the magazine in order to finish that book. Went from there to book editing. So I worked in that space as a developmental and then acquisitions editor for a business called Globe Pequot Press. Then went to Lions Press, which was an imprint of Globe, kind of on staff and then as a contractor back and forth. from there, published a couple more novels. Started up my own small press called Bangtail Press. I've published at this point, I think, 20 some books through Bangtail, including a number of poetry books. And then published a kid's book in there somewhere, and then finally this Mumblecusser, which
Yeah. Yeah.
feels like it's. I've been telling friends I'm a little surprised by how much this particular book means to me. It feels like it's not just another project, man. This one's important. I think in part because it's been in the works for so long. The earliest poems in the book I wrote in my 30s. So they're 20 years old. So
Right.
you start writing poetry. You have a collection in the back of your mind at some point. Well, maybe this will be part of the book. You never know.
Right. Right.
So it's very cool to finally see it come together.
Yeah. I mean, it's a 30 years worth of poems finally come together in a collection. How so I've noticed in the process, I mean, from the time you had a child, how old are your kids at this point, or your child?
Uh, we have one boy. His name's Corey. He is 12 years old, just going into 7th. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I was wondering about that. I thought, wow, man, I wonder if that was like, if the son is like, a 30-year-old man at this point. I didn't know. I'm thinking of my own existence, right?
Yeah.
But that's
No,
cool.
there are a handful of fatherhood poems in the book, and most of those are fairly new. But they do trace roughly sequentially the fatherhood poems that are in the book go from infancy through to when he's 10, 11, 12 years old, and those are mostly presented sequentially. It's kind of salted throughout the book, if you will.
So you didn't actually uh dabble in poetry at all until you were like almost in your 30s? I mean, you were obviously an established writer for a long time before you even gave poetry a sort of a thought, or
I have written poetry for a long time. I have
yeah.
not written good poetry.
Well,
I've written.
that's beside the point, right? I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, I should have just asked directly, when did you start writing poetry?
um, Probably college, I suppose.
Yeah,
I've been a long time journal entry diarist,
right.
and anytime you start, you know, seriously keeping a journal and keeping a diary, if you read poetry, at some point you're going to write poetry as well.
Right.
I think that I have thought, I don't have any proof to back this up, but I have thought that that's one of the things that makes poetry unique as an art form, and that anyone who's an avid reader of poetry is going to try to write poetry at some point, whether it's any good or not.
Right.
Um, you can watch a film and have no impulse to go make a movie, or you
Yeah.
can go to a museum and not want to be a painter, but you read good poetry and eventually you want to try your hand at it. Maybe I could do that.
Yeah.
And so I've been an avid reader of poetry my whole life, all through high school, college, of course. But uh, the work I was doing in that space did not reach a point where I was comfortable sharing with people
Right.
until my 30s, at least.
Right. Did you have any particular sort of favorites or influences that you'd say as poets that you read?
Yeah. And it's I hesitate a little bit to start listing them off because there's so many. I mean, maybe because I have not gone through I haven't gone through the MFA track. I've not been trained as a poet. So there's always an element of a little bit of insecurity and uncertainty with regard to my own work. It's like, well, maybe what am I missing? Yeah, maybe somebody else would see the flaws in this that I can't see. Um, and so as a consequence, I think almost every professional accomplished poet that I read, I find something in there to admire and take from. You know, it's almost like, you know, you're a magpie picking shiny things out. You know, it's like here's Carolyn Forche. You know, well, that's a beautiful turn of phrase. You know, I should put that in my journal. You know, or here's Bukowski. How did he do that? You know, or you know,
Yeah,
Jack Gilbert. How did this? You know, holy
right.
shit. How did he pull that off? You know,
Exactly.
and
Yeah,
so lots of marginalia in the poetry I read. You know, it's exclamation points and
right.
underlinings. You
Yeah,
know, so I very democratic, I guess, in my admiration for different poets.
yeah.
Um,
I feel,
it's
I feel,
rare for me. It's rare for me to read. If a poet is good enough to be published and have their own book, it's rare for me not to find something that I admire. You know?
yeah, yeah. I agree. I mean, and I'm very similar in that regard. I mean, when people ask me that question, it's like, well, I mean, there's too many poets to list,
Yeah.
and sort of give credit in this little space, but but
I
there,
mean, I think it speaks to the health of American poetry. You know, on the one hand, amid the cacophony of modern life, poetry doesn't seem to be especially relevant or important. You know, nobody is making a big deal out of the new poets being published in the New Yorker or wherever. On the other hand, the quality of work that's being produced is just extraordinary. You know,
yeah,
you almost, uh, you know, you every time you turn around, there's a new poet on the scene who's just doing amazing work.
yeah,
Um, so it
and
seems a little bit of a contradiction in some ways.
and what I find myself picking up a lot of new poets is that they, you know, it's the uniqueness of not only their voice but their own particular take on the art form and what they want to do in a poem. And so that I can be continually surprised by what I'll find in a new poet in a poem, and I'll think, wow, that's great. I mean, you know, and that goes back to what those old modernists tried to kick off, right? It was like,
Yeah,
do something different, do just be yourself and do it, and I think that's true. I mean, since we all are different, we can't help to be not different.
yeah.
If we somehow manage to pull that off on the page, that's that little thumbprint and it sticks with you. It's like visiting with somebody. It sticks with you.
You bet.
Yeah, it does with me anyway. Yeah. So, what else I wanted to say off the top of my head? Oh, one of the people that you've published in your press, Bangtail Press, poet wise, is Mr. Zarzyski, Paul Zarzyski.
Indeed. Yeah, yeah.
Paul is a favorite of yours.
Paul's a fantastic poet. To my mind, he's one of the best poets working,
Yeah, yeah.
and very very privileged to have worked with him on, geez, three books now, I guess. Um,
Yeah, I saw that in your catalog. Well, that's what I
yeah,
saw was like the three, I think.
yeah,
And then this last one, this Going It Alone,
yeah.
uh, is putting it under his arm and riding off into the sunset, kind of a collection. Great poems, though. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a good collection of poetry. So yeah, Paul's a good friend. I mean, I credit Paul with sort of giving me my second permission to write poetry later on when I was in my 30s, I guess, at that point. And because I bumped into him. I was teaching school in Augusta, and he was living on Flat Creek and working
Oh
for
yeah.
the Arts Council,
Yeah.
and teaching poetry in the schools, and brought him in, and he's just been Yeah, he's been an important person in my world since that time. He's a hell of a poet.
He's a great poet and an important figure in Montana letters as well. You know,
Yeah,
he's been part of the scene since. Um, well, I remember that old Onyx Smith movie with Hugo, where he
right.
visited.
Kicking the loose
Uh,
gravel.
yeah. There's a scene where Hugo and Jim Welch and Paul Zerzinski are at the picnic table, and they're
Right.
all kind of shooting the shit.
Yeah, in
Um,
the backyard.
yeah. So that must have been what 1980 or 79, something like this.
Yeah,
Um,
right around there. Yeah, about 79
yeah.
probably, somewhere in that neck of the woods. Yeah, he looks really young. They
Yeah,
all look young.
yeah,
We all looked young at one time. Yeah,
right.
yeah.
It's
Well,
hard.
go ahead.
It's hard to imagine. Just uh, as an aside, it's hard to imagine the influence that Hugo has had and continues to have on Montana poetry and Montana letters. You know, you watch that movie and you think about the how that person and that person's work has echoed around the region. You know, he's influenced. It's the 7 degrees of Kevin, whatever,
Right,
game that they play in Hollywood. Who knows
right.
who knows who. Here in Montana, it's 7 degrees of Richard Hugo. You know how many he taught this person, he taught this person, he taught this person. So,
Right. Right.
yeah.
Yeah, I know. And he did. He was a larger than life character, and and I credit. I mean, I credit him with. I mean, I loved his work and continue to like his work, but he managed to try to discourage me from being a poet.
Oh, there's a story there. How tell me about that.
Well, I mean, he I went to him. I'd taken a couple of classes. I started to take classes from him, and I was an odd student, a mix of, I like you. I mean, I don't say like you, but we were Montana kids. Right. I mean, and then you go to the university and you feel this sort of, I felt this sort of intimidation and didn't feel like I was up to snuff with so many people who were farther down the road than me. And when I went to a creative writing class that Hugo was teaching, I just was intimidated as hell by everybody, right? And and I also got bored with college at times and wanted to just go out and get a job with regular people and do that kind of life. And so I just dropped out. And I started once and I didn't even go to the first class. I was that scared, that terrified of the whole situation of being judged. And then I did go for about a week or 10 days, whatever that cutoff was, where you could drop out of school and get your money back. That
Yeah.
10-day cutoff, I dropped out. So I was in a Hugo workshop for about 10 days. And like I say, terrified. I was in awe of him, but afraid of the other students and afraid of my own insecurity. And so then later on, in the early 80s, uh, I took him a stack of what I'd been writing, all this bad poetry that I'd been writing, and because I was working and I had all this stuff, I handed it to him. I knocked on his door, and he was so generous. Come on in, and he looked at it, and as he would read through one of these things, he kind of threw pubic forehead over those eyeglasses at me. He went back and he'd set it aside and he'd read another one and he'd say, because I told him, I said I was, working, and he said, "Well, this is so you're working all the time and you're doing this, and well, you've done a lot here." He said, "It's very admirable. The only problem is it's just not poetry." And I was like,
Ouch. Ouch.
talk about crash,
Yeah.
and and what he meant by that was, to his view, there was, nothing resembling what he did in poetry. There was no music in the poetry. And I think that was the main thing that he saw, was just this lack of an ear that was attentive to the sound in the language, which was, the whole musical aspect of poetry. And because it was just really, like hard, fast, profane, angry, fuck the system, that kind of poetry. And it didn't turn his jets on at all. I mean,
Yeah.
and it wasn't great. But when I go back to it, I've found things there that are worthy of, I think, being called poetry.
You bet.
But in his view, that was what he told me. He told me to try writing fiction. He told me I needed a bigger palette. He said the ideas here are too big to be contained in a poem, that I needed to, focus down. And so, and I went away and I continued to do what I was doing because it was all I had time to do. So he didn't discourage me exactly, but he made me aware of the fact that I had work to do if I wanted to think of myself as a poet in any way, shape, or form. So I couldn't call myself a poet for about another 20 some years after that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you also said somewhere that Jim Welch encouraged you at some point.
Yeah.
Do I remember that? Yeah.
I got started in high school because he came to our high school. We were lucky enough to that. And those, his first writing, of course, was poetry, right? I mean, he started with Dick and those, writing the Earth Boy 40 poems, that first collection of poetry, were the poems he used to teach us about poetry. And it was like, yeah, I mean, it did turn me on in my mind that I could write poetry out of my life, which is what he was doing.
You bet.
And he said, use your experience, what you know. I mean, that old write what you know thing. And
Yeah.
so that was permission to write poetry, and I've been writing poetry ever since.
Yeah.
Uh, Hugo told me I was on the wrong track. I should maybe try fiction. I didn't have time to write fiction. As you know, it takes more time and organization to write something larger. And so eventually, after I was teaching high school, I ran into Paul, and he allowed me to join my kids and write poetry with them. And by the time I ran into him, what I was writing, yeah, he told me was poetry. He told me Hugo would love that poem. And so, I mean, that gave me sort of permission to go forward and consider thinking of myself possibly as someone who can write poetry,
You bet.
whatever that means. Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's read another poem.
Yeah, man. Any requests?
Well, I have, mine. I can bump all over here and read several requests. How about The Party? Page 64.
Perfect. So there are certain poems in this book uh, that have garnered more attention than others. The Dog Stars, which I read at the opening, uh, tends to not be one of those, although it's a favorite. And this is another one that not a lot of people have mentioned. So it's a treat to read one of the more ignored poems, if you will. But this also is a favorite.
Cool.
So The Party. I was the guy who wore collared shirts to parties in high school, envying from the edges the effortless cool, those swaggering few in raveling t-shirts, threadbare jeans, so thin, so fluid, so effortlessly self-possessed. They're gone now, many of them, victims of cancer, car wrecks, suicide, the debt's called due for every lovely smoke, every beautiful bottle of booze. We will die eventually and forever. Where was I? Saying something about empathy. I drove past the Bozeman High football game last night, and the lights of the field were an island in the dark, filled with parents cheering, groaning, laughing, passing along mugs of cocoa, maybe spiked with booze. And it struck me as the most heartbreaking thing. This life lived at the edges.
Yeah, I like that poem a lot.
I think it. Who knows where a lot of the poems come from? You just write them down and then you try to figure it out later. But I think that one speaks a little bit to the distance of the artist, the writer. I don't think that that's unique to me by any means. I think when you set yourself as an observer of the human condition, the fact of that observation sets you apart.
Right.
You're no longer participating, you're watching.
Right.
And I think that's one of, whether that's cause or effect, that's one of the aspects of being a writer, is
Right.
you're always watching rather than participating.
And not only watching, but you can't help but be processing at the same
Right.
time. I mean, it's like even though we I think most writers, most observers like to think of themselves as fair or objective, but we still can't help sort of making our own sort of judgment calls on things as we go along, based on our
Yeah.
own experience and what we see going on in front of us, and trying to imagine what their lives are like. And this poem just does a great job of that, from the speaker's point of view and from the people that we see, particularly if we've grown up in environments where we've been around this kind of experience. And most people in America of our ages have, right?
Yeah.
And continue, I imagine, to at this point. I'm not sure
Yeah.
if things are quite the same as they were back then, but I'm guessing pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I like
Yeah.
that poem.
The value judgment is essential. It's part of the aesthetic, uh, and it's part of maturing as a writer. I think whether it's novels or whether it's fiction or poetry, you have to feel secure in
Right,
your own aesthetic judgment.
right,
So and you have to be willing to throw some metaphorical punches in defense of it. So this is how I see the world, and
right,
it may not be right for you, but it's right for me.
right, right. Well, anything? Yeah, let's just read a couple more. I mean, I think these are great poems that we should definitely get a bunch of them read. How about Meat?
Okay.
Am I picking all the ones no one else has ever asked for? I love
Yeah,
this.
yeah. Well, yeah, man. So meat is another favorite. What page is it? Do you have it right in front of
53.
you? 53. Got it. So I come from a family of hunters and fishermen, outdoorsmen, and the closest thing I have to church is uh, is going bow hunting for elk in the fall. So the last couple of weeks in September, I'll go with family to the Missouri Breaks in northeastern Montana, and we'll disappear from the world for a while and go chase some elk. And if we're very lucky, one of us will kill an elk for the freezer,
Right,
and we process all our meat ourselves. So we'll kill the elk, we'll field dress the elk, we'll let it hang for a couple of weeks in a cooler, and then we'll get together as a family and we'll process the meat. And especially as a father, now that I have Corey to help participate in that ritual of caretaking the food, preparing the food, has really become kind of unduly important to me. I really see it as kind of an essential ritual.
Yeah.
And this poem speaks to that. It's called Meat. We worked in jeans and vests, kneeling before the swinging carcass, peeling at our sections of skin. Its hair rank with the smell of wallows and urine, odors of the rut, slicing skin away with strategic sweeps of our knives. We worked in the silence of those who have done this 100 times before, the meat cold from its hanging, hands cramping. If there is a heaven, it will surely have this, a father and son working toward a distant meal. Grace. I hope there is no end to it. I would have it again and again.
Yeah, that's it's just got great I mean, not only that sort of like you laid it out in the beginning, ritual and it's almost there's almost a spiritual sort of quality to it in a way, but the detail of the processing and the work and the numbing fingers I
Yeah,
mean that's just anybody that's done that, that puts you right there, and hopefully it does whether you've done it or not. But yeah, and anybody that's ever, I mean, all you can do is talk about the smells, and you hope that those can trigger something for someone else. But yeah, and that smell of deer tallow,
yeah.
it's like wow, it's a hard one to sort of describe. You wind up referring to other kinds of meat smells or animal smells or
Yeah,
trying to do it. But you do a good job of capturing that
it,
scenario, I think.
it's really an essential aspect of the human condition. I think is that food preparation, especially as a community. And I think maybe I'm just getting a little old and grumpy at this point, but I think we've really lost something essential that's not part of everyone's experience. I think we need to know where our food comes from, and we need to have the experience of preparing it for the table with friends and family, and then sharing it with friends and family. I think every aspect of that is an important part of the community. Um, but,
I when I
yeah,
lived in, of course, I grew up over here on this side in a little town called Alberton, and then
yep,
at one point I moved to Augusta and taught school, and I was there for 6 years. And of course, when we were there, my kids were just very, very young, and so my wife was like all consumed with these two babies, pretty much, and taking care of that situation while I was working in a Class C school as an English teacher and all the other coaching and stuff that goes along with that. So my world was we but we got the one salary, that
yeah,
teaching salary, and we basically lived on venison
yeah,
uh, for those years. And so, uh, but then from there, we moved up to the res, up on the Flathead Reservation, and up there, I couldn't hunt up there. You had to literally leave the reservation to go back to Montana state land somewhere to hunt, and at that time, I think I was like coaching speech and drama or something. So I didn't have time after school or even weekends.
yeah,
So there was hunting season, right? And and I was up there for 7 years. And by the time I got out of there, I, uh, I kind of lost my real sort of interest in shooting things anymore, or that aspect. You know what I mean? And but my kids just picked it up. So my one
oh,
son, one didn't, but the other one
yeah,
did, and he's just a huge big time hunter. So I've managed to benefit from getting elk and whatnot from him
yeah,
over the years. Yeah, but I think that's very true. It's you feel cleaner in your consumption when you know exactly where your meat's coming from, and if you
you
have
bet,
prepared by hand,
yeah.
literally. Yeah.
Well, and my first published book was on the ethics of hunting, and
Hmm.
so that's always kind of in the back of my mind. Is this right action or wrong action? Is this morally responsible or morally reprehensible?
Right.
And I truly believe, and I'll argue with anyone that hunting and killing and eating a wild animal is ethically uh, the gold standard. I mean, this is if you are going to eat meat, this is how you should do it. And then it goes down from there. So eating meat from a factory farm is something else entirely from eating meat that you're responsible for yourself from
Right.
a ethical standpoint.
And even when, like when we were up on living up on the res, there was we knew a couple of guys that people that raised their own beef, and
Yeah,
they didn't shoot them up. They didn't, and they finished them, and they did their own little graining operation in the last
you bet.
stages. Or they were fed on grass, and then they had. I walked into this guy's butcher shop, and I mean, my God, it looked like an operating room. I mean,
Yeah,
it was just clean, and he took care of all that meat, and then you got the meat from him, and you felt great that you were consuming this meat.
you bet. Yep.
Well, how about some more poems? How about the gallery?
That's a good one. So that was one of the older poems. Corey was in kindergarten, so he was 5 years old, I suppose, 5 or 6. So this one is 7 years old. It's called The Gallery, and I think it speaks to an experience that most parents can relate to. That you want to encourage your child and be happy with their work, but then they show you the stick drawings. So you're as a parent, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. It's like, well, do I tell them what I really think, or do I? No, this is The Gallery. The boy's masterpieces, when he deigns to show them to us, come as crumpled accordions from the basement of his backpack, worthless until illuminated by the lamps of the living room, displaced from kindergarten toward our amazement. You did this? How wonderful. I study his little face, a stranger to subterfuge, and watch it reappraise, reevaluate, reconsider, shift on the fly to self satisfaction. He's a genius and wasn't even aware. We keep them around, the march of stick figures with catenary smiles, acres of jade green grass under frozen yellow suns, sheafs of perfectly square houses, chimneys crowned by gray curlicues. His mother takes the latest scribble and smooths it flat, fixes it to the fridge with magnets. I pour a glass of cheap Malbec from the box and throw on an expression of polite interest, browsing couch to credenza. I see a little Rothko in this one, I say. Pathos in a flying bird, a squashed letter M. Maybe this one symbolizes our mortality. To which she responds, don't be such a dick. Which isn't what I'm going for here, not at all. Wife, can't you see my uncertainty, my fear of what comes next? There are days when I feel myself crumpling, when our house tilts and twists at its perfect corners, when my smile fails to reach the dots of my eyes, and the wax sun chars the edges of its page. I study this idol, our family holding hands, and we look so alone. Wife, there are days when it's all I can do to keep it inside the lines. Wife, there are days when I am simply terrified.
It Yeah, I mean, that's to me, that is it's the beauty of what a poem will do or can do, right? I mean, a poem is able to somehow articulate what we don't say or what we do say and what we mean and what we don't mean. All of that. Uh, I mean, that's where we do it is in a poem. It doesn't seem to me like that there's a lot of other places where we can do that very effectively. I mean, it's hard to do it even in conversation and really make it land. But for me, when I pick that up in a poem and I read it, it lands big time. Does that make
I'm
sense?
glad you I'm glad you like it. Yes, yeah, it does. Um, I quote in the afterword to the book. I quote Charles Simic. He said, "The secret wish of poetry is to stop time. The poet wants to retrieve a face, a mood, a cloud in the sky, a tree in the wind, and take a mental photograph of that moment in which you, as a reader, recognize yourself. Poems are other people's snapshots in which we recognize ourselves."
Right.
Um, and I'm fully on board with that sentiment. I think that's if there's a definition of poetry, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's why we do it. That's why it's important. Um, because there's no other way to really effectively, I don't think, communicate that other than in a poem. And that's a
Yeah,
good one. That does it.
thank you.
Most of us have all been there for that one. If
Yeah,
if
yeah,
you're if you're well, not you don't even have to be married and have children necessarily, but it's just that interplay of communication that goes around in a family situation and what's said and unsaid and what you wish you would have done and what you didn't do and all of that stuff that goes on. A
yeah,
poem like this brings that out for a person, and that's huge. Yeah. That's why we write poetry, I think.
yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, damn it, we need to read another poem or two. Uh, what do you think? You got one you want to read?
Yeah, sure. So I spoke to the at the beginning. I spoke to the need for communal effort behind the book of poetry. We all come together in order to accomplish something. One of the um, one of the main forces behind this book is our mutual friend Aaron Parrott.
Yes.
He's the executive director of Drumlemon Institute, and he has his own territorial press. Uh, Aaron is a fine press letterpress printer, and I've known Aaron, I guess, for 10 years now, 11 years. And one of the first projects we worked on together, uh, he did a letterpress broadside of this poem, "The News," which is in this book. So this poem was important for me because I think it marks the beginning of a very good friendship and a very fruitful collaboration with Aaron Parrott. Um, and it's the first broadside that was printed, that was letterpress printed. And it's called "The News." You want the good news or the bad news? They say. Me, I always want the bad news. It's March, the worst month, if you ask my opinion, though nobody does. Maybe that's the bad news. There's ice and the silence that comes during a car crash as your wheels leave the pavement. But underneath, a subway tremble, the sounds of life elbowing to the front of the line, robins stretching at earthworms and ants pushing sand grain boulders up their hills. Bird, birds and dogs always have someplace better to be. That's the good news. The way you can lie in the grass and close your eyes against the sun and hear bees browsing dandelions. Winter receding like a forgotten math test that probably didn't matter much anyway. I don't believe in God, but if I did, this would be why. All the goddamn good news.
Yeah, yeah. The good news and the bad news.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, one of the and one of the things that I guess I recognized in your work, and I for some reason, if someone asked me the question of what, well, because it's like regional poetry, what is Montana poetry, or what are poets in Montana? What would those people be like? How would that be different than any other place? And it's like, well, I don't know. I'm from here, and I feel so kind of local that I don't really know a lot of other places as well as I do here. But one of the things I've this seems to be this always sticks with me is the is this kind of an awareness. It's always it's like not exactly self-deprecation always, but it's an awareness. It's humor. Humor is like the leveler of all things. It kind of has got to come in and say, hey, I don't know it all. Behind everything that you throw out there and prophesizing, you just come back and say, but that's just me, right? You've already said that once here in this interview. And I recognize that in your poems. That happens throughout many of these poems. And it's just kind of what I think is a part of this Montana sort of overriding personality that we grew up with anyway.
Yeah, that sure could be. Yeah.
Uh,
I think it's important. Speaking for myself, one of the risks of poetry, writing poetry, is taking yourself too seriously. Again, just for myself.
right,
I'm sitting down and I want to write a capital P poem. And here's the
right,
rose garden, and here's I think it's important to step back and have some perspective. It's like, well, maybe this is it's a poem, maybe it's a good poem, maybe it's a bad poem, but I have something to say.
right,
Uh,
right. That sort of qualification, and done usually with the touch of humor, seems to move throughout a lot of the poems. And I mean, I don't know. You have another one you want to read off the top of your head?
sure.
I mean, I'm
So
looking at, after you do that, I'm just looking on like 2021, like Tiny Triumphs and Halloween Candy, or like you can read either one of them. Uh,
so along with there's a poem called Dubious Circumstances, and that was the oldest poem in the book. That was written in my early 30s. This is probably the next oldest poem. This is Satan at a Stoplight. I wrote this after a visit to New York. My wife and I were dating. When we were dating, we started out long distance. I was living in Montana. She was living in New York. And during one of my visits to New York, uh, we took a day trip, rented a car, and took a day trip out to Long Island. And so I found myself driving through Brooklyn and then through Long Island. And I came home and I wrote this poem, Satan at a Stoplight. He sits at the wheel, thrumming rust-red claws on the dash, anonymous in the field of idling engines and blooming exhaust, the acrid odors of impatience. Reluctant tenant since his famous humbling fall from the ethereal skies. He's never felt at home here, not really. Not until he bought this souped-up black Toyota, tricked it out with spinners, lift kit, a basso beat deep enough to shake windows, a hood full of rumbling penal fire. Home. He can hardly believe his luck. The soul of Henry Ford, tangled in a rosary, dangles from his rear view. He adores the 5-lane freeways where he can drive with his left blinker always on. Swerve and slow unpredictably, eat fast food, talk to his agent on a cell phone, wink at the Mormon family of 4 as he cuts them off close, testing dad's capacity for the profane. He adores the cloverleafs, the exhilarating rev toward takeoff before a squealing stop, inches from a bumper sticker. It's a life, not a choice. He gives them a horny thumbs up, grinning around his mouth full of razor blades. But most of all, it occurs to him now, watching the swaggering pod of slow pedestrians in a crosswalk, the teenagers losing their jeans, and hip young mothers with strollers and phones. Most of all, he loves the noise, the diesel engines clattering like coins in a can, the angry horns and wailing ambulances, the eternal cacophony of car alarms and construction. He bows his head to fiddle with the radio, delighted by how we've all finally forgotten that indeed God speaks, but only in silence.
God's not rolling coal.
Right?
Yeah, that's great. That's a good one. I
It's
enjoyed that.
I lived in New York for several years with Karen, and New York has a lot to recommend it. But one of the things that wore me down after a while was there was no silence. You know, the city is always moving and always noisy. You can't escape it.
Right, right.
Yeah.
We drive over and visit our son in Seattle, and he's like right there, right downtown, kind of on First Hill, and it's kind of a hospital area. So I mean, his sirens are kind of coming and going all the time, and it's yeah, it's the city's a
It's
busy
hard
place.
to it's hard to adjust to.
Yeah. Well, we should squeeze in at least another one or two before we're run out of time here.
Any request? It's up to you. Whatever you would like.
21.
Beg your pardon. 21.
Green Candy, 21.
Okay. So this is another trip. We were visiting family in San Francisco, and actually, I think this was the trip. I pulled a trailer from Bozeman, um, a utility trailer from Bozeman, and emptied out an old storage shed in Palo Alto, where my wife went to high school in Palo Alto. She had a storage shed with her mother where a lot of her childhood memorabilia, old boxes were there. So I drove a trailer down, emptied it out, and then brought it back. So I pulled a utility trailer through Oakland on the way back to Bozeman, and then this poem came out of that experience. And it's called Halloween Candy. Watching my son sit cross-legged on the floor, sorting through his bag, upending the bag to move all the gummy bears into one pile, Kit Kats into another, oversized Tootsie Rolls, Almond Joys. Such richness, such absurd wealth, such a sense of order imposed before the slaughter. The satisfying rip and tear and chew, the miracle of each bar lost among the abundance. One more Nerds, just another Snickers. By the end of November, there will remain a small bag of M&Ms, a single bag to be saved, treasured, considered. He might eat it one day. Such a perfect little package. It reminds me now of driving through Oakland a few years ago. 5 lanes of stop and go traffic, the muted cacophony of engines and horns, the odors of exhaust and seared ozone. Mozart on the radio couldn't drown out 5 lanes of despair. I sat behind the wheel, reduced, diminished, lost within the horde. There are so many of us now. There are so goddamn many of us.
Yeah, one would need that little M&M's package.
Yeah. when that's all that's left, it's valuable. When it's just another bag in the box, then it's something else indeed.
Yeah.
So
I
if we're running out of time, Mark, I have a question for you.
yeah.
Um, this is, I think you said you've done 60 some of these interviews now.
Yeah.
So how has this experience talking with Montana poets, interviewing them online and recording the interviews, how has that changed your view of Montana poetry, or has it affected your view? Has it changed your approach to your own work? I mean, that's in itself, it's an impressive accomplishment. I mean, putting 60 interviews in the bag, I mean, that's a valuable record.
Yeah, yeah. I that's kind of the way I look at it is, and I just sort of kind of once I started doing it, and because of the pandemic, and we were kind of locked into it, and I mean, it was locked into doing something like along those lines virtually, and I just thought, well, I think this would be a terrific contribution. So I just want to try to do this with the time that I have. So I just started doing it, and every time I did it, I enjoyed it. Every time
Yeah,
I did it, I learned something new from I mean, even people that I've known all my life, and good friends that fellow poets that I mean, in a different circumstance, you maybe wouldn't have the same conversation or wound up hearing them read their work and be able to have that there for other people to share as far as we can go with it. I mean, these things will exist now in some kind of a site, and I'm going to do my damnedest to make sure that there is a site either at the. I mean, right now there's about half of them are at Humanities Montana in an area there, and all of them are through MCAT listed on YouTube. You can go to Missoula Community Access Television on YouTube, and they're all there. I would like to see them all at the Arts Council too, and I thought that was going to happen initially, but things just kind of again pandemic related, and all things kind of fell through the cracks there, and funding maybe too. God knows we don't need to go into that whole political can of worms on funding anything in this goddamn state anymore, but. I did I just loved it. I loved every single one of these things that I've been able to sit down and experience another poet's work in the state. Many people I didn't know really. I mean, I don't really know you. I met you once at the fact and fiction reader thing that you did those
yeah,
books,
yeah.
three different parts of the state. I met you once there at fact and fiction. I think that's the only time. And I was very well aware of you as a publisher with Bangtail Press, but I didn't really, I mean, just because I read mainly poetry probably over the last decade or so, and I really haven't read widely of the Montana canon. It took me just last year, I think, or the year before, to finally pick up a book by Russell Rowland, who's also
Oh yeah.
a person who's got 85 books and of out there to read, and he's a terrific writer. And so I mean, I was when Aaron, who is a mutual friend, who was kind enough to publish a book for me also here in the last couple of years, when he mentioned that you had got this book of poems together, would I be interested in looking at it? And I said, yeah, sure. I mean, I was in the service mode of Poet Laureate business anyway. Yeah, why not? I'd love to check it out. I don't know, not familiar with his work really, and I loved it. I mean, I just think it's a terrific book of poems, and so I mean, it was just natural to then ask you to join this party, along with so many just really good poets in the state of Montana. It's great, and I mean, one of the things I thought about doing at this point is maybe trying to just sort of take these now and maybe turn them into podcasts, because it seems like so many people are consuming podcasts because of the fact that you can do it on the move, and you don't have to stop and watch something or anything like that. You can just listen, and poetry is designed for that anyway, I think, and conversations are. So
You don't.
yeah, I think I'll
No,
try
I
to
think
do.
that's a great idea.
Yeah, yeah. But anyway, it's been a lot of fun. Uh, and I guess our time is about up, Alan. If anything, I would love for you to close with one more poem. And you know, what kind of came to my mind in the back of my mind was, what's the title of that poem where you're looking at the Paradise Valley and how things have changed. And that was a poem that stuck with me in terms of this whole Montana experience that we've experienced in our lifetime here.
So when I was a kid in high school in Livingston, uh, me and my buddies would uh, in the fall we would take off from school and we would go duck hunting in Paradise Valley. And in the absence of having a good place to throw out some decoys or set up a blind or any of that, we would drive up and down the valley and we would look for ducks and geese on the river. And when we spotted uh, waterfowl either on the bank or in the water, we would figure out how to get to them and jump shoot them.
Right.
And in those days, it didn't seem like people minded that much. Most anybody would allow a couple of kids and waiters to go cut across their place and go shoot a duck.
Right.
You can't do that anymore. Um, so that's what this poem is about. It's called Jump Shooting, 1986. Teenagers, we used to jump shoot the Yellowstone. That was us on the shoulder of Highway 89 glassing the river. If we spotted birds, we'd knock on the nearest door. Mind if we cut through your pasture? Or maybe we just scurry across road to river. No one seemed to mind much. Local kids in camouflage and waders, hunching through the willows to rise, shotguns snug to shoulders, the geese below us. Then the whir of wings honking in 1, 2, 3 shots each, the shattering of the frozen morning. If we were lucky, a goose angling down to tremble on the rocks, wings askew. Joy isn't the word here, but it's close. Joy and loss. Years passed. If you live in Montana long enough, you will eventually come to remark upon its decline. That's what I really want to write about. How we all managed to mourn for the time before. That was my childhood. These days, though, if you stand above Paradise Valley at night, the dark floor is carpeted in yard lights, and the river grows little on its banks, so well as knapweed and no trespassing signs. The station keeps backing away from the train. Honestly, it's probably better not to pay too much attention. You're only going to have your heart broken again and again. If not now, then soon. It just takes time. Just a little more time.
And there you have it.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, I mean, it's that's the reality of being alive and living a life, is things are going to change.
Yeah.
And someday, you know, that's kind of that story, that poem, that jump shooting story about crossing a field just to go out and grab a couple of ducks and come back and no one cared, and maybe the rancher waved at you as you're cutting back across the field. Those days will seem just as unrealistic as no barbed wire do it to us
Yeah,
in our,
yeah, yeah.
you know, it's
Right.
just a trip. Well, thanks for that,
Yeah.
Alan. Thanks for joining this party.
Thank you, Mark. It's a delight. I really appreciate the attention paid. Thank you.
You bet.
And thank
And
you. Thank you
uh,
for supporting the book with your blurb too, man. That means a
oh
lot.
yeah, no, it was my pleasure. Check out Mumblecusser from Drumlummon Institute, and you'll be the happier for it.
All right.
All right.
Thank thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Bye
Yep.
bye.
Bye-bye.
Got a lifetime filled